Welcome to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. The only podcast where it's okay to talk in band. On this podcast, you will be able to hear conversations with some of the greatest names in wind band conducting, composing, and arranging. We'll also visit with great college, high school, middle school, and elementary band directors to get their thoughts on various aspects of being a band director. We'll have regular check-ins with instrument specialists, music dealers, and instrument repair professionals. And if that's not enough, we'll even have regular conversations with Dr. Tim, who will help keep us motivated. That's Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. And now, here's Charlie.
Welcome to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends, and this, our 26th episode in the Band Talk podcast series. And as always, I'm honored that you are joining us to listen. We have a fascinating conversation coming up for you with the multiple Grammy award-winning international composer, Michael Daugherty. We'll get to that in just a moment. But folks, here it is, September 2020. We're starting our 9th month of the year, and 6 months since the world shut down due to the coronavirus. Like you, I was sure hoping that things were going to be back to normal by now. But alas, the only normal we seem to be experiencing is the new normal, where, as I like to say, nothing is new and nothing is normal. I was talking to a friend this morning, and he was telling me about a school district in the Midwest where middle and high school students will start the year online, and that elementary students will be in a hybrid situation. And for those teachers teaching band, they will get to see their students live for 1 hour every 2 weeks. Wow! I simply cannot imagine that. And I'm really having a hard time wrapping my arms around this one. But you know what? I know that those teachers are going to find a way. As I speak with more and more teachers around the country, and as I view more postings on social media, there is one thing that resonates with me more than anything, and that is the old saying, where there is a will, there is a way. Or as I like to put it, nothing motivates like no alternative. Friends, there is no alternative. This is the time we have to tap all of our creative resources. We have to stay in communication with our colleagues. We have to keep our administration, our parents, our students in constant communication. And together, we have to make it known that we are not going to let music die. We are not going to let music die in our schools. Music is too important. It's too important in our lives. And music is too important in our schools to allow this pandemic to get the best of us. Oh, our teaching scenarios will be far from perfect. But there are ways to get the job done. There are ways to reach out to the students, to get students to continue playing their horns, for us to stay in communication with them. And we have to let them know how proud we are of them. We need to provide them with hope and a sense that despite not seeing them in person, that we still recognize that they are getting better. And the key word is better. It is time to celebrate any victories we can find. And it is time to let them know that you are proud of them. All of them. Yes, even the ones who haven't touched their instrument since the time our virtual school bell rang for the last time in the spring. On an earlier podcast, I interviewed Chip DeStefano, the director of bands at McCracken Middle School in Skokie, Illinois. If you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to do so. Chip offered some fantastic advice when he said that his number one goal was to make sure that when school gets back to face-to-face learning, that all of the students come back. Our job during this pandemic is to make sure that the butts that were in the seats prior to it starting are in the seats once we have some sort of normalcy return to our schools, our schedules, our classes, and our lives. Don't think all about this too long, folks. It's only going to drive you crazy. Instead, we just have to deal with it. Complaining is only going to make it worse. We got to jump in. We got to start somewhere. That's the first step. And jumping in and starting will be the action that leads to motivation. As my good friend Dr. Tim says, motivation does not produce action. Action produces motivation. As this school year starts, I encourage you to jump into action, put on your best face, and tell yourself to put your best attitude forward, no matter how hard it might be to begin with. Regardless of how you need to deliver instruction, you are still the deciding factor whether your students will have a great experience or not. I wish you well, and I know that all of us involved in some way, shape, or form of education are proud of you, and we support you because we know that you are making a difference.
ThePodcastingStore.com is your one-stop shop for the finest in podcasting, remote and virtual teaching, and amplification tools. ThePodcastingStore.com features leading brands like Audio-Technica, Heil microphones and headphones, Rolls Electronics, Rode microphones, PreSonus, Yamaha, Focusrite interfaces, Roland, and Blue Yeti. With a product mix compiled by experienced educators and podcasters, ThePodcastingStore.com focuses on providing products that assist you in more clearly communicating your message to your audience, whether you're an educator, podcaster, or hobbyist. ThePodcastingStore.com. Visit them soon.
So I was judging a band festival many years ago, and I'm sitting at the judges' table, and this ensemble comes on, and they play this work called Niagara Falls, and I just was spellbound by it. And I got home, and I listened to it, found a recording, and listened to it again. And then a couple of years later, I was at a CBDNA convention, I believe it was, or an ABA convention. I can't remember what it was. And I heard his Rosa Parks Boulevard. And then I was at I know this was an ABA convention in Miami, Florida, which was the first opportunity I had to meet him. And our good mutual friend, Gary Green, played bells for Stokowski. And I just like, wow, this is over the top. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to perform a couple of his works with the Vandercook Band. But this guy is amazing. And I think he is the brightest star on the horizon for the wind band world and the music world. And I'm so honored to have my friend Michael Daugherty on the podcast. Michael, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us.
Sure, it's great to be here.
So, Michael, you grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where your father, according to your bio, was a dance band drummer. So what are your earliest musical memories?
Sure. Well, if you can imagine, back in the 1950s, I grew up in a small house. We had a family, mother and father, and four brothers. Fifth Avenue, huge trees lining the street, like forming a tunnel. Riding bikes around. It was just the grocery store was a block away down a brick road. It was kind of the last of that particular era. We had a player piano in our house, and I remember putting a piano roll in the piano and pumping the keys and watching the keys move up and down. So it really was through that player piano that I first heard a lot of different kinds of music. Yeah.
So what was your first instrument? Did you start playing piano?
Yeah, right. We had a piano, and I started to improvise on it. And I think I can't remember, 6, 7 years old. My mother decided for me to take some piano lessons. I remember the first piece I learned was the Marines hymn. I started to play piano, and I really was. I didn't have to be prodded to practice. I really liked the piano, and I just got into it. And a big thing I remember doing when I was a early teenager was going riding my bike down to the library downtown, which had a pretty big record collection. at that time. And I checked out records by Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane. I didn't know who these people were, but I would bring these records home and listen to them and try to figure out what they were doing. And I would play them and then try to play the piano at the same time. And that's the way I kind of self-taught myself ear training and jazz, was trying to figure out what these players were doing, because at the time there were no books that one could buy to learn jazz or anything. You pretty much had to learn it by ear.
So did you ever play a band or orchestra instrument?
I played percussion a little bit in middle school. I played timpani, but I got thrown out of the band because I would improvise all the time. The band conductor would say, "Mike, you're not playing what's written," and I don't know. I improvised all the time and I finally said, "You know what, you can't play in our band anymore." But I moved over to choir, and I was actually the accompanist for the choir. So I probably learned a lot about composing, because as I was accompanying the various choirs at the middle school, I would be seeing all four parts and how it was working together. The high school choir the high school choir director then heard me play when I was in ninth grade, and then invited me to be the pianist for the concert choir at Washington High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And there we did a lot of innovative works. We did like Leonard Bernstein, Chichester Psalms. We did Hindemith. We did just lots of choir music. And then I also had a rock band called the Soul Company. And so I had that going on. So I was really involved, really from the very beginning, with classical music and rock and jazz at the same time.
That's fantastic. You're the oldest of five brothers. They're all professional musicians. A few minutes ago, I was listening to your brother John sing on This Land Sings recording. So he's obviously
So actually, that's not my brother.
Oh, that's not your brother? Oh,
no, it just so happens he has my last name.
I'm sorry. So tell us about your brothers that are performers.
Sure. Well, I have four brothers. I'm the oldest, Michael, and then Pat. So I'm 66 years old. My brother Pat is 64. He's retired now, but he was a pianist for years for the Martha Graham Dance Company in New York. He actually married a dancer from the Graham Company, and he played jazz in New York and so forth. My brother Tim is 62. And he's the Dean Martin of the family. He's for years played piano on cruise ships around the world. I don't think he's paid taxes in 20 years. He is now unemployed because the cruise ships have shut down, and also, he's getting old now. So, but for many years, he played on cruise ships, played lounge piano. My brother Matt was a band teacher for many, many years just outside of Miami. And he still lives in the area. And then he taught at the high school level. And then my brother Tom, works in rap music, and he lives in Los Angeles. He has worked with the likes of Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and some of these rap artists. So he's out there in LA. So yeah.
Those conversations around the Thanksgiving table must be just unbelievable.
I think sisters are good at staying in touch. Brothers are not so good at staying in touch.
Okay.
When our grandmother was alive, she was the one who kind of, had everybody who kind of kept the communication flowing. And my father passed away back in 2011. And so we used to gather then. But the last time we were together was about 2009. We played a Daugherty reunion concert with all my brothers. So I played the piano. Pat plays the piano as well, and then one brother plays the drums and the bass, and my father played the drums. One brother plays the trumpet, and so forth. So we did a reunion concert back in Cedar Rapids, and that was the last time that we were together, really, as a musical group. But hopefully, maybe we'll make it back one more time.
So what do they think of their older brother being this internationally recognized composer?
Well, it's interesting. They're very proud Irishmen. We're all Irish, Michael, Patrick, Timothy, Matthew, Thomas. Very proud Irish guys. So everybody thinks that they're important, you know. But I mean, we try to support each other, you know.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
You know, back in your hometown, uh, you wrote a piece for the church for an organ. Am I correct? That recently?
Yes, I wrote there was it was a 100th anniversary or something like that of St. Paul's Methodist Church, where I went to church as a kid. I wrote a piece for 5 trumpets and organ. Um, the Water is Wide. I actually
Yeah,
took that folk tune and wrote it for 5 trumpets and organ, and went back and conducted that.
that's great. That was a great
That,
piece.
that was great. Yeah. So you know, I've written all sorts of. I've written a variety of pieces for different levels, everything from Alligator Alley for middle school to, you know, works for major orchestras and opera companies and so forth. So I pretty much, you know, it's funny because composers in the past used to do that. Like Copland did that, Britten. Um, it was very common that you would write pieces, you know, for younger players, then write pieces for professional players as well. And at least that's what I've tried to do. Also, you know, it's funny. I know that your work is primarily in band, and one of the things I've tried to do is to diversify as well. So I don't write just band works. You know, I write maybe a band piece every 2 or 3 years, but mostly orchestra pieces and chamber music pieces. And then, you know, I come back and do a band piece every once in a while. And I think that's very good because then I don't, you know, I don't want to write pieces that sound like a band composer. And, you know, which means that, you know, just doing conventional things with the band, I've never wanted to do that. I've always wanted to push the boundaries.
And when you do that, I think your palette continues to expand, which I think is fantastic, you know, which is I think one of your trademarks. So you talked about getting the records from the library and coming back and trying to play it. And is that when your interest in composing started?
Well, it just was like a puzzle to try to figure out, you know, Thelonious Monk, what scales is he playing on the piano, or you know, what are those chords? I remember actually once, you know, in 20th Century Fox, the beginning of their movies, there's that theme. Da 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 da. I remember going around to my music teachers and say, "Can you show me? I can't figure out what those chords are," and no one could help me. So I had to just figure things out myself. One memory that sticks out is I played basketball throughout high school, and I was driving my car to a basketball practice, and the University of Iowa, which was a half an hour from where I grew up, they had a radio station where they would play classical music during the day and jazz at night. Anyway, they were playing a piece on the radio, and I said, "Wow, what is this?" So I pulled over, listened to it, and I wrote it down. And I really wasn't sure. I said Mahler or something, Ninth Symphony, the last movement. And so I went around and asked my music teachers at high school. Nobody knew what it was. So I went to Coe College, which was a small college in my town, to the composition teacher. And he didn't know what I was talking about. And then there was a guy in town who was this eccentric guy who knew lots of kinds of music. He said, "I think you mean Mahler." At the time, you know, 1972, Mahler was not as well known as he is today.
Right.
So that was kind of the beginning. I was really, you know, I really loved the sounds of the orchestra. But in Cedar Rapids, the orchestra primarily played like Mozart or Beethoven, and they played it in a very kind of academic way. So what really wasn't until I went to North Texas State as a jazz major that I heard the Dallas Symphony play the Samuel Barber Piano Concerto, and I was in the front row. I had a student ticket, and I was blown away by that. I think the second piece in the second half was Matisse de Mahler of Hindemith, and I just said, "Wow, this is really amazing." And that's when I started to get interested in composing in a serious way.
So you went to North Texas State because you wanted to pursue a jazz career?
Well, in 1972, there really were only 2 places in the United States that offered jazz courses. That was Indiana University, and North Texas State at the time is what they called it. Berklee School of Music in Boston had just started. It was not accredited yet. So really, there were only 2 options at that time. So I went to North Texas State, and you know, there were literally hundreds of jazzers there. I mean, and the jazzers were mostly from out of state. And I remember the first time walking through the practice rooms in North Texas. They were the old ROTC dormitories. And I remember hearing dozens of sax players playing giant steps in each one in a practice room. And I thought, wow, this is kind of amazing. And North Texas State was really a commuter school, which I didn't know at the time. So in the weekends, it'd pretty much be empty except for all the out-of-state guys who were the jazz players. So there were always jam sessions going on and so forth. And just to show you how things have changed, at that time, the jazz department was in a separate building. It wasn't part of the School of Music. It really wasn't integrated as it is today. I mean, at that time, there was no such thing as a jazz major, as an ethnomusicology major, as a music theater major. Those things did not exist at that time. So music was pretty much categorized as classical or non-classical, or what the jazz guys called a legit and non-legit music. So,
wow. So from North Texas, you go to the Manhattan School, and then you eventually get your doctorate at Yale. But along the way, you decide to go to Paris to study at Pierre Boulez's IRCAM in Paris. What was that? You had this fascination with electronic music or computer music, or what?
Well, let me back up first. So at North Texas, my education was great, but at the time it was there was a particular style of writing spearheaded by people like Elliott Carter, Milton Babbitt, and others. Kind of a very modernist, atonal kind of music, which fascinated me, and I couldn't figure it out. So I was the kind of person that always wanted to go to the source. I really couldn't learn things by a book. I needed to be there where the action was. So I decided to go to New York. I ended up studying with a guy, Charles Warden, who was like one of the most despicable people you could ever meet in your life. I mean, a very elitist 12-tone kind of composer. But it was a great lesson for me because it was like going to boot camp where I had to be really tough. Somebody who would insult me, and challenge me all the time. It was kind of the old school of teaching I remember in North Texas State, many teachers would smoke as they were teaching. And I remember for Renaissance Counterpoint, we had to memorize like 300 rules, and it was in those days, many of the professors and the teachers were very tough. So New York was a place. I remember something I still say to my students today. When studying with Charles Warren, and I said, "Oh, I'll have that ready for you next week," and he'd say, "No, you'll have it ready for yourself next week." And I've always remembered that. You're on New York. It's a tough town. And back in the 70s, if you think of movies like The French Connection or these movies shot in the 70s, New York was a very tough town. I was living right near Harlem. There was graffiti everywhere in the subways. There was crime everywhere. It was really a tough town. So going from Cedar Rapids to Texas to New York. But I ended up getting a job at Carnegie Hall as an usher. And I think that was a very important experience because I got to hear some of the greatest conductors of all time. Herbert von Karajan conducted Berlin Philharmonic. Bernstein conducted the New York Philharmonic. Horowitz's last concert. Sinatra played there. Billy Joel's first major concert at Carnegie. So for 2 years, I was, heard these amazing soloist entertainers and orchestra. And I remember, I have to tell the story because I think it's important kind of insight into things. First of all, when I went to backstage to try to get a job, the guy said, so where are you from? I said, Iowa. He said, okay, well then I guess we can hire you. I said, why? Because people from Iowa are honest. I remember that one of my jobs was standing out front of Carnegie at the box office to kind of, to guide folks or whatever. And somebody, it was a big concert. Somebody came up and gave me 4 tickets and said, here, I don't need them. Why don't you give those back to the box office? Well, I could have gone out and sold those tickets probably for a lot of money, but I returned the tickets to the box office. And the guy said, you returned these tickets? The box office guy, yeah. And so he told the manager. And then I got promoted because, most people would have sold those tickets. So my job was to move the marquees from the basement of Carnegie Hall up to upstairs to put in the 2 glass windows in front of Carnegie. And down in the basement of Carnegie Hall was like stepping into the Phantom of the Opera lair, where they had all these hundreds of old posters of, Toscanini conducting, Stokowski, the Marx Brothers, all these old posters. And so those kind of memories of New York, and those had a very important impact on my music. And one of those things was, that I was hearing the best, and so that meant I had to be good. Besides Bernstein being around a lot, Pierre Boulez was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, and he was doing a lot of contemporary music, which like Berio and Stockhausen and this sort of stuff. He was really probably the most important and the most famous composer conductor at that time. And so I went backstage after a New York Philharmonic chamber music concert where they did a bunch of world premieres, and introduced myself and said I was very interested in going to IRCAM because he was starting this new computer music center in Paris. And so he wrote down an address and said, okay, contact this person. I was able to contact him, and I applied for a Fulbright, and by chance I was able to receive one. So that's how I ended up in Paris. And so here I was in Paris in 1978. That was like the place in the world for contemporary music at that time. It had just been built. Boulez was there, Berio was there, Xenakis was around. Every composer wanted to be at IRCAM, and so here I was. Didn't speak a word of French, so I had to learn very quickly. And kind of like Hemingway or Grant Wood or other artists in the 1930s, Copland went to Paris, and that's where I ended up, in Paris, instead of studying with Boulanger or whatever. Here I was at IRCAM with Pierre Boulez, but I was way over my head. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't understand computer music. So again, like going back to Iowa when I had to check out those records from the library as a kid and try to figure out how to learn jazz, I had to learn contemporary music, this kind of avant-garde contemporary music on my own, which is what I did.
Fascinating. That's a fascinating story. Your works are just unique. I mean, you have such an incredible background in history, but your works are unique. They're never cookie cutter. They always offer an incredible element of surprise. And when I listen to them, there's always something in it that brings a smile to my face when I listen to your music. So where do you get your inspiration?
Well, my inspiration really comes from things around me or history, history which I connect with in some way. So I'm not interested in, let's say, French history or Greek mythology or something like that. I tend to be interested in things that I've grown up with, or historical figures which are important to me. So my works are always based on some idea, and that idea might be a person or a place or a thing. As far as historical figures, I've tried to be very diverse. From everything from Lincoln to Rosa Parks to Paul Robeson to used car salesmen to Elvis to Jackie Kennedy. Andy Warhol. That's the piece I'm working right now. I have a commission from the Pittsburgh Symphony that I'm working on, called 15 for Andy Warhol. That's the piece I'm doing right now. Amelia Earhart. That's the violin concerto I'm writing right now, called Blue Electra. So I'm very interested in historical things or places. I love to do road trips. So Route 66, Niagara Falls, Sunset Strip, Rio Grande. Many of these pieces I've written are places that I have been to. And I think that goes back to my interest in Charles Ives. And when I went to Yale, that's where Ives went to school, and that's the reason I chose to go to Yale for the doctorate. And I actually was able to write a paper under John Kirkpatrick, who was the pianist, he was quite old at the time, he's probably in his 80s, who actually premiered the Concord Sonata of Charles Ives. So I wrote this paper on Ives, and I was able to share that paper with him and go to his house on a number of occasions for feedback. And and I think when I lived in Europe then, and when America seemed very, very far away, I realized, the importance of America growing up, the things that were important to me, and how to connect emotionally. So I think that this connection I have with history and important important historical figures and the travels I've done as a way to have an emotional connection for when I'm writing something that makes sense. And I should mention, like the Woody Guthrie, which you mentioned, which was the latest release I had on Access, for example. That was another project which was very fun to do, and to go down to Oklahoma and learn more about Woody Guthrie and read books about him and listen to his music. And then I wrote this hour-long piece inspired by Woody Guthrie. That's one of the latest projects that I just finished.
I had the opportunity to perform 2 of your works, like I said earlier, at the Midwest Clinic. We did Raise the Roof with Svet Stoyanov doing the timpani solo, and Gary Green conducted it. And then a couple of years later, I did the final movement of Lost Vegas. And you came into that rehearsal and you paid me the highest compliment I've ever been paid by a composer. And you looked at me and you said, "You really know this score." And I said, "Well, I better, or Gary's going to kick my rear end if I see him." But you came to both rehearsals and you offered this wonderful ear, and you offered such thoughtful information to the ensemble and to me, and suggestions. So when you're in those situations, do you feel like there's limits to what you can say or what you can offer?
Well, I must say that, in most cases, and what's the case with your great band, was that the band composers and the ensembles are usually, in most cases, very prepared. It's very rare that I've come to a dress rehearsal, where things aren't together. So band conductors are known to be very meticulous in their preparations. I don't know why. I guess it's just a tradition within the band world to do that. So my father always said, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say it. So, or Dale Carnegie, How to Win and Influence Friends. I remember I read that in high school. You always say a positive first before you say a negative. So I think that was great. Really, I love this and that, but maybe, it's funny because some people, if you hire a painter, let's say, to paint the interior of your house, and they spend a week, then you walk in and the first thing you do is say, "Hey, you missed that spot up there." You start with the negatives and saying, "Wow, what a great job painting. I love it." And you look around, "Hey, maybe you could just look at that one spot over there." So I tend to be positive because it is an educational experience. One. I think that the only time I might be critical is if I feel somebody has blown it off, and it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes in the professional arena, actually, where people can be a bit jaded or not paying it because things are very rushed. Usually there's not a lot of rehearsal time and so forth. But I think because the pandemic that we're in and the fact that these orchestras, these professional players can't play right now, my hunch is when they go back someday, they're going to be much more appreciative of the music they're playing. And, I think that some of those people who are a little jaded will be a little less jaded when they get back and play again.
It's a great insight. Hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. So you won your first Grammy, or first set of Grammys, or 3 Grammys with the Metropolis Symphony. How many total Grammys have you won?
Well, I personally have received 2 Grammys, and the only way a composer can receive a Grammy is for best classical contemporary composition. So I was very fortunate to receive it for that recording you mentioned, Metropolis, which had a piano concerto, Deus Ex Machina. And then about 4 years ago for Tales of Hemingway, which is a cello concerto. But the actual recordings have received 6, each one 3. Has to do with the best performance, or like in the case of Tales of Hemingway, the soloist received the best soloist. You actually don't personally get a Grammy. They're very stingy with those. So only the soloist would actually get the Grammy, but the recording has received 3 Grammys. The Tales of Hemingway recording and then the other one. So it's a total of 6 altogether.
So you mentioned this earlier, and I recently heard This Land Sings, which is inspired by the life and times of Woody Guthrie. And by the way, I think it's fantastic. I just love it. I love the creativity, the second movement of it where you've got the strings and you've got the mallets that are double. I just think it's just so wonderful. It's so vibrant and so colorful. So you mentioned that you went to Oklahoma. I got two questions. First of all, how did this work come to be, and who are the Dogs of Desire?
Sure. Well, the piece came to be because a group in Tulsa, the Tulsa Camerata, it's a contemporary chamber music group, asked me if I'd write a piece inspired by Woody Guthrie, and they thought I'd be the person to do it. And I decided to take the challenge because I had no idea what I could possibly do. And so I thought, wow, that'll be an interesting project. It'll push me in a different kind of direction or challenge me to come up with some new ideas. So that's how that came about. The Dogs of Desire actually did the recording, and that's a group that was started by David Allen Miller. He's the very fine conductor of the Albany Symphony, and he has a subset of the symphony called the Dogs of Desire. And they commission many young composers, especially. David has commissioned hundreds of works for the orchestra and for the Dogs of Desire. And they have a festival each year. And so he wanted to record it. So, I said, great. So let's do it there.
Yeah, it's a great recording. Like most composers, I'm sure you have, every one of your composers is probably like a child to you. And so many of them been collaborations with orchestras and professional ensembles, wind ensembles. Do you have one that sticks out in your mind as being maybe a little bit more memorable than the rest? And if so, would you share any remembrances of that?
Well, you mentioned children. You usually you try not to have a favorite child, right? You try to be equal. It's usually, the piece that I'm working on at that time is the one that, sticks in my mind the most. But I think probably the Metropolis Symphony, when I was kind of finding my legs, so to speak, as a composer, I spent about 5 years writing that piece, which is a long time. But I think that having the opportunity to spend a long time on a piece and really reflect on it, I think really paid off, because what happened is that it was one of those things where I really wasn't planning to write a huge piece. So when the commission came about, I was teaching at Oberlin College. It was about 1986 or so, and it was the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Superman comics. And they were doing a big exhibit at the Cleveland Museum of Art of the Superman comics as artwork and the costumes and so forth. So, and I was a big fan of the old television show from the 50s with Reeves, George Reeves, who played the original Superman in the TV show. By the way, some trivia. By the way, that theme for the Superman television show from the 50s, that was written by a guy named his last name was Burke, Herschel Burke, and he also wrote the music for the Rifleman TV show, which is one of my favorite scores of all time.
Chuck Connors, yes.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I should say we haven't talked about it, but also the amazing music that was written for television, the films that I grew up with, like in the 60s. I mentioned like the Rifleman, Star Trek, the Twilight Zone, all these shows. I mean, just amazing composers were writing for television at that time. And then, of course, the films, the incredible stuff from MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, 40s, 50s, 60s, some amazing composers at that particular time who wrote for orchestra. This is all orchestra music, or in some cases for television, large wind ensembles, actually, because they had limited budgets. So, sorry. So we were going back to the favorite. So I think the Metropolis is the one that sticks out, just because it took so long to write that piece. Mm-hmm. I started out writing two movements. One was Mitzet's Piddalik and Lois, and then those were played by the Cleveland Chamber Orchestra. And for the first time, I really had a strong reaction from people saying, "Well, I really like that." And before that, I'd say my music was probably, like many composers at the time, kind of abstract, atonal, non-referential kind of music, and which was kind of the thing that most composers were doing at that time. And and I got excited about it, and so I kept writing more. I wrote another piece, another movement for the Metropolis, but I wasn't sure it would be a symphony yet. Anyway, Christopher Rouse was a the late Christopher Rouse was a guest composer at Oberlin, and I spent the week with him. Took him around to all the concerts and picked him up at the airport, took him back. And as I was taking him back to the airport, he said, "I'm just curious, Mike, do you have any music you could send me?" So I sent him a movement of Metropolis Symphony. I think it was O Lois. And David Zinman, who was the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony, listened to it and then invited me to come out to Baltimore. He played one of the movements with the orchestra. And then I said, "Yeah, I'm planning to write one more movement called Lex." He goes, "Okay, when it's done, why don't you send it to me?" So when it was finished, I sent him the Metropolis Symphony. He decided to program it at Carnegie Hall, if you can imagine, of all places. So that was kind of my big break. And then a record producer from Decca Records was there in London who happened to hear the piece and wanted to record it. And I have to tell one other funny story. So when I went back to Carnegie Hall, this time not as an usher, but as a composer, I walked backstage, and the guy who had hired me like 15 years before was still there, right? And he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm having a piece played tonight by the orchestra." He goes, "Oh, yeah, right." So then when I came back later that night to take a bow, and he came down, "Well, I guess you really did. Well, you're the first usher we've ever had who ever had a piece played at Carnegie Hall." So I thought that was a great story.
That's fantastic. What a
Yeah.
fantastic memory. Too bad they won't let you go down in the bowels and get that poster and take that poster with you. You
Yeah.
probably have one. So you've been commissioned to write a new work, and how do you formulate your ideas and begin the process? Take us through that first couple of days or week when you've agreed to it, but you haven't necessarily started putting the pen to the paper.
Well, let's go back to the Woody Guthrie. So this new work which just came out on Naxos called "This Land Sings," inspired by the life and times of Woody Guthrie. So that's to write a piece about Woody Guthrie. And the first thing is, I thought, wow, what can I possibly do? So I decided, okay, I have to have singers. Okay, so I decided Woody Guthrie usually often sang with another singer, frequently a woman. So I said, okay, I need a male and a female singer. Okay, that was the first step. Then I thought, okay, I need to have singers who can kind of cross over and do like country singing and do classical singing. So I had to find people that I thought could do that. Then I had to figure out the instrumentation. What kind of instrumentation do I want to do? And originally they wanted me to do something like the Schubert Octet or something. I go, no, that's not going to work. No. So I needed something kind of lean and mean, sparse. And I thought, because the Great Depression in the 1930s and the Eastward of Soldat ensemble came to mind, which is, you have the Great Depression going on, and that's what Stravinsky did when the First World War hit. He moved from writing these giant orchestra pieces to chamber music pieces, and he wrote Eastward of Soldat as one of those pieces. So it's a very sparse piece. You have a violin, double bass, clarinet, bassoon, trumpet, trombone, and double bass and percussion. So, sorry, I mentioned the double bass twice. Anyway, it's a very lean and mean with lots of holes kind of orchestration. But I thought that would work very well for that kind of time period from the 1930s. Then the next thing was like the attitude of the piece. So to do that, I went down to Oklahoma. I went to the Woody Guthrie Museum, spent 3 days there looking through the archives. They have everything about him there. They have they even have his record collection. I remember I spent one afternoon looking. They would bring boxes of records out, and I could look at the record collection. Woody Guthrie would write notes on the record jackets. One of his favorite pieces was a record of John Cage back in the 50s, if you can imagine. And Woody Guthrie, who was a folk guitarist, right, folk musician, artist, and so forth, who really didn't know that much about music, wrote a letter to John Cage saying, "I really like what you're doing," and they have that letter there at the museum. So he also did artwork, and so you just get in kind of the personality. And then I decided to take a drive, and I kind of drove the path that all the people from the Dust Bowl, the John Steinbeck Grapes of Wrath, this path that they did to go to California. And I drove that for a while through Oklahoma and Texas through the back roads. I took photographs. I always like to take photos. Many of the CDs, many of the CDs and my music that's published now are photos that I've taken actually. So I love to take photos. Like Gary Green is also a photographer.
Yes.
Yeah. So, kind of archiving things in a visual manner. And then I finally come back to my studio and I start to knock things out. And I should also say that I also work with players. That's very important. All the pieces I've written, I'm frequently am consulting players. I have players come to my studio here in Ann Arbor, and I pay them, of course, but I'll have them play through what I've written. You mentioned Raise the Roof, the timpani concerto. I worked with it. I remember I wrote that during the summer. I can't remember what year it was, but I met a master's student from Michigan, probably for about 6 weeks or so, and I would meet him every day at the school, and he would play through things I'd written. I had him play solo timpani rep for me, and I wrote the piece with a timpani player. Actually, I think that's why the piece works well, because it's something that timpani players like to play. It's challenging. It has some new ideas, but also really works as far as the tunings of the timpani and so forth. So I do that with all the pieces I write. And with the Woody Guthrie piece, I had singers come over and sing as I was composing the piece. And so it's very interactive, kind of like when I had my rock band back in Iowa. You'd have practices, and it's kind of if you think about jazz groups and rock groups, it's very interactive, right? Composition can be very private and lonely sort of profession. So some people like that. They like to work in isolation and not talk to anybody or have any contact with people. I'm very much the opposite. I like input. I like to work with people. So for me, composition is a collaborative process.
So as an artist, I mean, I'm sure you come to those times where you get a roadblock too, right? So how do you push through that roadblock? Do you read a book? Do you take a walk? Do you listen to music? Do you just go outside and scream? I mean, what do you do?
Well, I think it's important to have a diverse life. So if I do hit a roadblock, then I will do other things. I might go out. I'm a swimmer. In the summer, I try to swim a mile every day, or in the fall and the spring, I ride bikes. That's one way, just to clear one's head. Sometimes to get in the car and take a drive is another way, But probably, it's like the way they teach you when you're a kid. If you're taking a test and you come to a question you don't know, instead of sitting there getting stuck, you skip it and move on to the next question. And so that's probably, I just kind of, I find that if one's in motion, if I'm in motion in some way, either physically or in a car or some kind of motion thing, that sometimes that will give you ideas.
In addition to your composition, your personal composition, you also teach composition at the University of Michigan. And you mentioned that you had done that at
Oberlin College.
Yeah,
well.
previously.
Yep.
Yeah. So what's the most difficult aspect of teaching a young composer to help them find their voice?
Well, one of the challenges is to change. One has to change with the times. I remember when I was a fellow at Tanglewood in 1980, the summer of 1980, and I was hearing the older composers there, Gunther Schuller and George Pearl, and some of these composers. I heard them. There was like a gathering, and they were sitting around saying, the young composers today, they don't know counterpoint. They don't know this. They don't know that. And every decade there's a change in attitude, a change in how orchestration is looked, counterpoint is looked. Now with technology, a lot of young composers are coming in. They learn stuff off the internet. And so they think, well, maybe they don't need that much input because they've already learned that. They've taught themselves by watching YouTube videos and so forth. So, but one teacher who was very effective in a sort of way was György Ligeti. And I was very fortunate to work with him for 2 years in Hamburg, Germany, after my studies at Yale. And he was somebody who just asked questions all the time. He was interested in what you thought, and you would ask questions. So that's kind of one approach I take, is I try not to know the answers, but to kind of, to ask people why they're doing what they're doing and so forth. But the one thing I do in lessons is detail. So if somebody brings in a band piece, an orchestra piece, or chamber piece, I have a big monitor. They plug their laptop in with Sibelius or Finale. And I have a speaker system. We plug into the headphone jacks. We have good sound, and then their scores up on a large screen, and we go through every measure of the piece. Look at. I noticed they have an accent here, but you don't hear. You've got piano for the strings, but you got the brass forte. So we go through all the dynamics, articulations. We go through all that detail work, and that's something that frankly, I never had a teacher do that with me. It's always kind of very vague, either telling stories or kind of very vague teaching. But I really like to get into the nitty gritty of the piece. But finally, I don't try to influence the actual sound world too much. Like, I don't try to say you should really change, this is too tonal or this is too atonal, or I try not to do that, because when I was young, I had many teachers try to discourage me, saying, this is wrong, that's wrong, don't do this, don't do that. I remember I had one teacher at Tanglewood. I had a guest lesson with a teacher who I won't mention, a very famous person. I had a lot of glisses. He goes, don't put glisses in the trombone. That's a cliche. It's funny because I use glisses all the time, even now in my pieces. So I just found it really wasn't constructive to say, don't do this. And I think, but again, each generation is different. The communication is different. And there's a film called The Blackboard Jungle with Glenn Ford. I think it's like from the 50s, where he's teaching like in a rundown school in the Bronx or something, with a bunch of hoods, and they won't learn. And then he realizes that if he has them read comic books or something, that he can teach them. And like, that's like, wow, like that's a new way of teaching. I always remembered that. So we're at a very different time, and now with the pandemic hitting and just the psychological thing. So, we have to keep reassessing, and things are shifting. And the one thing, also, I'm sure you've heard this too, is like, I used to hear the old timers complain, like in pop music, they don't write melodies like they used to. I remember like people put down, I remember distinctly when the Beatles came out, my father played drums for years in dance bands, and some of the guys he would play would say, the Beatles, there's no melody there. Well, Paul McCartney actually came out of Cole Porter. I mean, his tune, now we hear the tunes, and there's melodies all over the place in the Beatles music. When I listen to rap, it's hard for me. I mean, I love James Brown, and I love soul music and funk music, but the rap is a stretch for me. But I know a lot of people are really into rap. So and if somebody is well known, they're getting a lot of play and so forth, I will give it a listen. I try to be open-minded, but it's as one gets older, we kind of get locked into certain things and so forth. So again, I guess the bottom line is to be flexible, ask questions, and don't assume you know everything, and then you won't be too frustrated being a teacher.
Okay, last question. So if you could come back in your next life as any professional musician, not a performer, not a composer, who would you want to come back as?
I think, I probably could have been a conductor if I really wanted to be. I don't pretend to be one. I know there are some composers now, especially in the band world, not in the orchestra world. They don't. Very rare it does a composer ever conduct in the professional orchestra world these days. But there are some composers who conduct band, and they go, and conduct their band pieces. But I would rather see a professional conductor, frankly, because it is a particular, profession and a particular technique that one has to have to be a good conductor. And so, but I'd probably come back as a conductor. I think I would.
Anyone in particular?
Well, I don't think I'd have the chutzpah to be a Bernstein. I mean, when I watched some of those videos, and I remember he was around at Tanglewood when I was there as a fellow. He was around for a couple of weeks, and I saw him conduct quite a bit, and saw his temper tantrums and outlandish behaviors at work, at rehearsals and so forth. And I thought, man, that guy has a lot of guts, man, to do the things he does. But Bernstein could do it. You couldn't do that today, probably. But I think to stand in front of the orchestra, especially, or a wind ensemble, you that's like the best place to hear the music. You're right there. It's like when you record, that's where the microphones go, right? The main mics go right above the conductor, 2-mic stereo, or if it's a Daugherty, 3 mics. But that's like the ideal place. You hear everything in detail. And, thinking like Mahler and Strauss and, Hindemith, even Stravinsky. I mean, most composers were conductors, actually. That's really not true now, but and so they were in front of the ensemble. And that's why their music is so good because they could hear everything. So I think, what about you? What if you came back? What would you want to do?
Oh gosh, I'd never been asked that question. I don't know who I'd want to come back. Probably as Maynard Ferguson, because I'm just a frustrated trumpet player. So there you go.
Maynard Ferguson, yeah, hitting those high notes. Maynard. I think he played in Stan Kenton, didn't he, at one time?
He did.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you a Stan Kenton story. When I was in high school, I wrote a music column for the school newspaper, and I would go sometimes to jazz concerts. And I remember going to Buddy Rich, playing in Muscatine, Iowa. I remember driving to a little town somewhere in Iowa. I can't remember what it was. And Stan Kenton played at some high school. It was a very little town in Iowa. And back in those days, that's, in the 70s, there really were jazz really wasn't academic yet. So there really wasn't like you would go play at the university in a good concert hall. That was to come later. So they were playing in high schools, most of these big bands. I remember going to hear Stan Kenton play, and it was unbelievable. I mean, they were like a gym. And I was sitting up close. And then afterwards, I went backstage and actually interviewed Stan Kenton for an hour. And I remember that he was very dark and pessimistic about music and very down. And, he had started his own record company and, because for years he recorded like for major companies, but, jazz was kind of out at that time. It was disco music, right, was coming in, right? So, jazz was out. And I remember seeing this guy and I thought, man, I do not want to end up like Stan Kenton. I'll tell you one other quick story. I was able to work with one of the greatest jazz arrangers, Gil Evans.
Oh, yeah.
When I mean work, I mean, he was, so when I went to Yale, somebody there knew Gil Evans, said he was looking for an assistant, someone to help him organize his papers and so forth and do some transcription. So I offered to do it, and I went to New York and met him. I went to his apartment many times over the years, those 2 years, and I wish I have no photographs, which really bumps me out. That's why I take a lot of photos now, because I have no photos of that time. But I remember one time I was sitting, he lived in a loft in the Lower East Side of New York for artists. And in the building, John Cage lived in that building, and the guy who did the Muppets, whoever that, Bill Henson, lived there, because I remember seeing them in the elevator one time with Gil Evans. Anyways, so I remember we're sitting in his apartment. It was a giant loft apartment, empty. There was like a piano, a couple couches, like a bed up in the loft. I mean, the guy was very poor, actually. And I remember there's a knock on the door, and they deliver a package, and he opens it up, and it's a Grammy. It's a big plaque for Birth of the Cool, in commemoration of the birth of the Cool, to Miles Davis and blah, 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 and Gil Evans. And it's this plaque. And he opens it up and says, man, I don't want a plaque. I want some money. I'll never forget that. And here was a guy who was like, probably, like Duke Ellington, one of the greatest jazz arrangers of all time. But the guy was completely broke. And he just made some bad choices in life, and also, didn't protect his copyrights. So that left an impression on me too, that, I didn't want to be like Stan Kenton, who felt, somehow the world had turned against him. And I didn't want to leave the earth that way. I didn't want to be like a Gil Evans where I've been totally screwed over by everybody. So those were two important lessons that, to try to find a balance. And so one of the reasons I became a teacher is because I didn't want to have to compromise artistically what I was writing. So I knew that in order to do that, like Charles Ives, who was an insurance salesman, I knew I'd need to do something else. So I didn't have to, compose. I didn't have to churn out educational music, or I didn't have to be a film composer where the producer would tell me, this is what you have to do. So I knew I needed to have an independent second profession. And my mother was a school teacher. And so I grew up with this. So I liked teaching. So I decided to go in that direction, which then gave me the opportunity to do artistically exactly what I wanted to do without any pressure or financial pressure. And I think that made a huge difference, because that's one of the reasons I've been able to go off in these different worlds and be creative. And I haven't had to compromise in the music I've written. And so those were two important lessons from, I remember growing up, that I've never actually told anybody before, but important ones.
Michael, you have given us so many gifts through your music, and I hope you keep giving them to us, because it's every time a new composition comes out, like I said, There's something in there that brings a smile to my face. And it's just such an honor to have some time for this fascinating conversation that you've opened up your heart and your soul, and I appreciate it. And I can't wait till the next time I get a chance to see you so I can thank you in person. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today. It was a really, really a lot of fun.
I wonder what that band director who threw Michael out of band for improvising on the timpani thinks about that today. And can you imagine going to the library as a youngster to check out albums so you could try to figure out what Thelonious Monk was playing? And how many kids on their way to high school basketball practice would be listening to a classical music station on their car radio? And even better, to pull to the side of the road because Mahler's Ninth Symphony was playing. From watching standing ovations at Carnegie Hall as an usher to getting one of his own for a performance of his work, Michael Daugherty has set a new standard for our music world. And like his music, he is a gift, one that we should all cherish. Well, that's Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. We'll be back next week with more great conversations. Until then, this is Charlie Mangini saying, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. If you would like to send a question to Charlie or have a comment, please send an email to bandtalkcharlie@gmail.com. We hope you will let your colleagues, students, and friends know about Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to being with you again soon.